Hi there, it's George again. Thanks for joining us. Last time we spoke about voicing in this lesson demonstration of what to expect in Introduction for Orchestration. Today, we'll be tackling another question from the email subscriber survey that I put out several weeks ago. And this was one of the early responses. And this question is, how to plan an effective orchestration with good contrast and maintaining coherence. Again, while I plan to obviously cover this topic within the lecture series, or course, whatever you want to call it, I'd like to obviously share some ideas that will help you think about orchestration in terms of contrast, coherence, composition today. So yes, let's crack on. To illustrate this idea of contrast and coherence, we'll actually be looking at just a piece of chamber music. I say just a piece of chamber music. I shouldn't get it down like that. It's actually the perfect piece to look at for this question. And that piece is Haydn's String Quartet, Opus 76, number 3. And we'll specifically be looking at the well-known second movement that uses the German national anthem, or what was known as the Emperor's Hymn back then, as the basis of some variations. I chose this piece because it exemplifies coherence both in composition and orchestration, which makes creating contrast a more focused challenge. It's also got a nice clean structural layout, which makes it a nice example to view how you might think about contrasts in orchestration, texture, and things like that. So in the composition, speaking now of coherence, the piece is coherent due to the use of a consistent theme in a variation form. Haydn doesn't actually vary the theme itself, but he uses the melody as a basis to vary the music around it. It's sort of like the old Baroque form of variations, but flipped on its head. Instead of building varied music above a repeated bass line, the music is varied above, below, and around the melody. Haydn limits himself to textural, harmonic, and orchestration variations around the melody without varying the melody itself. In orchestration, the music is, I suppose, even more coherent, as it is limited to the string quartet. While the instruments in a string quartet are different and offer good contrasts of timbre if used effectively, they are also a homogeneous group. Their sound and timbre are similar. They blend and combine well together as well. Therefore, we have two simple ways there, but big important ways in which coherency word. But anyway, how coherent this piece actually is. It's based on the variation form and a consistent, homogeneous ensemble. So I suppose now, having said that, having said how coherent this piece is from the outset overall, having taken a step back, we must now think, how does Haydn manage the challenge of contrast? Because there's a lot, like I say, there's a lot of consistency built in, there's a lot of similarity built in. Haydn has to be careful he doesn't create something mundane and boring for us all. So basically what he does is vary what's happening around the theme in each variation. Haydn is careful to manage the subtle differences in the quartet, utilising the cello and viola in later variations to give us a clear colour contrast. He's also careful to alter the texture of the music by sometimes providing more homophonic material in some variations and more contrapuntal textures in others. In increasing the counterpoint, Haydn naturally moves our perception of the melody as a foreground or middle ground idea. So we get a bit of a dance of parts. So sometimes the melody is relegated behind the counter melodies. Sometimes it is level or ahead of them. What's important, however, is that dance creates a feeling of contrast as our attention is moved toward and away from the the melody, and the two outer variations are particularly important for really putting the melody at the foreground, while the inner variations create a bit of, like I say, this dance of the layers, between the layers. So if we start with the theme itself, then it's a good place to start in the theme and variations. We can see that it is plainly set in a homophonic melody and accompaniment texture. The second violin outlines the melody harmonically, as we can see here. It's got the same sort of rhythm for the majority of the piece, against or this extract at least, against the violin, at first violin, and obviously that's a homophonic texture. But it's lower than the melody and sort of supports it quite nicely and harmonically. He then reserves, obviously, the viola and cello for this punctuation of cadence points. They become more active as the theme progresses. But obviously in this opening, which we're focusing on here and have on the screen, you can see they just come in and out, just add a bit of weight to them cadence points. So let's take a listen to the first 20 seconds or so. This extract here, it should stop somewhere around here, I think, if I remember rightly. And Haydn, obviously in the next variations, doesn't vary the theme, but varies what's around it. So given this restriction, while you're listening, what do you think Haydn does? What do you, in the next variation, how will he create contrast? What will he do? So that was obviously the theme, and we're now moving on to the variation. I asked what he did, what you think he did, rather, to create some variation. So let's take a closer look. As we can see, the melody is now passed to the second violin. So in a sense, he's creating a sense of repetition and coherence here. The violin was used for the melody last time, and unless you were watching this live, you might not recognize that the melody had been passed on at all. You might have some sense of perspective in a recording, say if the second violin was more in your right channel of the earphones or left, you might hear it that way. But obviously you probably need to be there to recognize that. So there's a clear consistency there. However, around the melody, there are a great number of changes in texture and harmony that become more apparent as the variation progresses. Haydn is deliberately holding some elements back, building anticipation for what's to come in future variations. For instance, the texture becomes more contrapuntal, moving from all four instruments to just two. The melody in the second violin and the counterpoint in the first violin. This creates a sense of interplay between the two voices and provides a contrast to the homophonic texture of the original that we just heard. Additionally, here the first violin is very active, switching between registers and strings on the violin, different sounds. It's quite vibrant, energetic, and that will naturally push it to the foreground. But it's also nicely distinct. So you've got the sustain here, so the melody can still come through, and the articulation, the nice staccatos here. Obviously, he switches to some slurred bowing, but the staccato's there, and this sheer 16th or semiquaver note values will nicely contrast it against the melody line. So yes, we start to get that dance, and we're reduced to two players and a change in texture. So as we now listen to this, I want again for you to pay attention to what Haydn is holding back in this variation. what's not happening, what's he saving for the next variation and the later variations, and how's he going to use those to create further contrast. So think about that while you're listening to this variation. Actually, I should have said that I was going to continue off the page. Obviously, a nice technique there is the use of the open string, just as a side note, which I find nice, quite cool. Quickly drops down and then back up, that registral shift. But yeah, well, that's another divergence. I need to control myself. I need more discipline. But anyway, yes, in the previous variation, the thing that Haydn held back was, of course, the viola and cello. In his first variation, Haydn focuses exclusively on the violin sound. In essence, he's trying to access the maximum difference that he can between the orchestral sounds he has available to him. That's orchestral in speech marks or whatever, quotation marks, because obviously this is a string quartet, not the orchestra. But obviously, as we're seeing, he has decisions of orchestration available to him, given what's available in this string quartet, this ensemble. So like, as we said, while the string ensemble boasts a great deal of blend and balance between the instruments, the individual instruments are still different from one another. The cello is not a violin, nor is the viola a cello or a violin too. In thinking ahead to how he might maximize timbre differences without using unstylistic special effects and techniques for this time, Haydn does the classically simple thing of taking advantage of the duo of violins in the quartet. That way, he's saving us the novel and contrasting sound of the viola and cello for our ears to lunch on in this variation and the following variation. So yes, in this second variation, what's he changed? He's reintroduced the other two instruments, the viola and the cello. However, the viola is still somewhat backgrounded. You don't really, it doesn't have a prominent part, so it's very much at the background. And we might say that the melody here is in the foreground alongside this supporting line, which could be seen as in the background, and then this middle ground line in the violin, which is kind of counter melody. So I suppose in a sense, Haydn could be said to still be holding the viola back. Perhaps that's a clue for what's going to happen next. But we have, in essence, a three-part texture now as well. So we've gone from 2 to 3. I'm trying to remember what happens later in this variation, but you could argue, obviously, there's 4 because the viola is participating in this variation. So yes, the cello takes up the melody an octave lower as well, while the second violin does what it did almost in the first variation, but is now above the cello, supporting it. It does sometimes switch into these different textural roles. It sort of becomes a bit more syncopated along with the first violin. But despite the lower register of the melody, Haydn maintains balance and prominence for the theme by contrasting the mid-high register of the cello with the lower register of the violin. So, the cello's in a nice strong position here on the D and A strings, while the violin is on its nice sonorous G string, but with that sonorous nature, there is a less of a cut, whereas less of a cut, a less incisive sound, I suppose. Again, I'm running out of adjectives, which contrasts with the cello, which is entering that kind of more lyrical, warm, and I suppose incisive, brilliant register. The register of the cello is perfect for getting this nice sung melody across through the texture. It's also a nice opportunity to generally change the register of the theme as well, having it down the octave. And that's a simple change to make, transposition of an octave. The first violin takes on a counter melodic role here as well. So that's another change. But it isn't a change, but it is, if that makes sense. Because obviously the violin has been doing this counter melodic role in the previous section, but it's a different context because it's more homophonic, a different style of counter melody. It's no longer 16th notes. It's moving much more by step. And as I say, it's focusing more on syncopations and suspensions rather, which is adding further contrast to this piece. So Haydn's clever orchestration and textural changes allow him to create an incredible amount of contrast with each variation, even though he is limited to the same melody and homogeneous group of the string quartet. As we listen to this, the opening of the second variation now, another short extract, we can try and predict what Haydn will do next with the melody and texture. What do you think he does next in this third variation? What has he been holding back and saving for us? I feel like I've already ruined this, but let's take a listen. Yeah, so that was the second variation. What was he holding back? I wonder. So yeah, did you guess what he was holding back for this third variation? I suppose interestingly, he shows less contrast this time in the textural changes, but offers more in the orchestration. The melody undergoes the most dramatic change. It's not a huge change. It's shifted obviously back up the octave and is given to our lovely viola, which now takes on a prominent role within the texture in a higher part of its range. I suppose a higher part for the viola at this time as well, in some respects, which often was reserved for more background functions in past string writing. So this is what Haydn's been saving for us, the viola. Obviously, in the previous variation, the viola was present, but it was used much more conservatively in an accompanying background role and at a much different register, very low down on its C string. The viola is possibly the most distinctive string instrument in the quartet, in my opinion. A little more nasal, I suppose you could say. It's kind of like the oboe of the woodwind troupe. Of course, I'm not suggesting the contrast is the same, but rather that Haydn is tapping into a physical characteristic difference between the viola and the other instruments by presenting it here. In saving the viola, just like with the cello before, Haydn ekes out another bit of contrast within his orchestra, within his string quartet. Textually, the music change is again too becoming a little more dynamic in the way parts drop in and out, increasing and decreasing the number of voices we hear at any one moment as the movement progresses. So obviously we open with two, but then the second violin comes in here, and as the first violin drops out, now the cello enters with a counter melodic part below the viola, so we start to get some dynamism within the variation, whereas often when we set off on a variation in the previous parts, in the previous variations, once he lays out what's going to happen, it largely stays similar throughout that variation, whereas in this one the consistency is going to be the fact that parts drop in and out. The character is going to be that things change around the melody a bit more. So in that respect, he's been quite reserved within the variations, saving that as an option for variation 3. Excuse me. Yeah, texturally the music is changing again too in other ways. It's become a little more dynamic. Parts dropping in and out, and this is different to the previous variations. The second violin drops the harmonic homophonic role it had, and instead it contributes to a counter melody. So in many respects, this is becoming more polyphonic again. Whereas the previous one had much more homophony going on within the texture. Perhaps the most significant difference between this variation and the previous one for me is a change in the grounding of the textural components. In the previous variation, the melody was relegated behind the counter melody, while here it's largely played back in the foreground. However, as I said before, this texture is a little more dynamic with its counterpoint and part writing. I think the other parts of the texture occasionally push through to the foreground of the texture here. Excuse me. Haydn positions the violins in lower middle registers to relegate the counter melody to the middle ground. The viola in its higher texture is pushed to the foreground via its distinctive sound, which we haven't heard much of in the movement so far, so it's foregrounded much more. It's also in a sturdy register that ensures it's mostly in the foreground too. Despite the viola being somewhat bullied, it's beautiful in the past. Generally viola jokes and stuff. I think I've actually put one in this presentation. But it's beautiful to hear it come to the forefront. So it's a loving banter we give the viola. And additionally, there's that dance-like quality, the layering of the texture here in this movement, with moments where the violins and the cello briefly emerge in certainly a middle ground, possibly a foreground role, as they come in and out of focus. So as you listen again, there's one thing to keep in mind. There's a unique aspect to the nature of this variation that distinguishes it from the others. Try to listen for this difference and consider its significance. Oh, sorry about that. Great stuff. I actually do like that effect where the violin 1 drops down there as well, and violin 2 comes in with a higher part. So if depending on how the string quartet was laid out, you might get a kind of switching of the positions if the violin 2 was on the right and the violin 1 was on the left. And then you get this cool change here again, which is sort of similar to this what was going to happen, but doesn't, if that makes sense. But anyway, that's a digression. I just noticed that in listening then. So moving on to the fourth and final variation, we have a full setting of the theme with all the players performing continuously. This variation is similar to the original version of the theme, but with some notable differences. First, we have not had such full scoring in any of the previous variations. Haydn is using all 4 instruments continuously in this variation. In the previous variation, I'm saying variation a lot here. I need a variation for the word variation, but I'm not sure you know what I mean if I could think of a different word. So in the previous settings of this melody, we had between 3 and 4 players. In the first variation, if you remember, we had just 2. So one simple but arguably substantial change here is that Haydn is using all 4 instruments continuously throughout this setting, this variation of the melody. Another change that Haydn makes here is by having the instruments use higher registers. After the opening 4 bars, you can see here, All the instruments repeat the music, but one octave higher, which is a surprising change. It would be on most instruments, but it is on strings as well, who can actually do these kind of large shifts quite easily across their registers. Other instruments you would have to be careful with ranges and register changes. But it's a substantial change to the sound quality, as you'll hear in the extract shortly. It thins the sound out, becomes more delicate but very lyrical, a bit of a sheen to it, especially at piano. And as I say, you won't be able to necessarily do that with the other ones. It adds a kind of intensity which is perfect for this sort of more climactic moment. It's the final variation of the movement. But at the same time, it's not overly climactic, because obviously this is only the second movement of a wider string quartet. So Haydn is not going to blow our socks off. So yeah, let's take a listen to that. And I have no questions this time. I don't want you to necessarily think about too much. Just enjoy and listen to, obviously, the change, how that colour change in the octave shift. It becomes more angelic and delicate when it shifts up. It really thins out the sound. It's less resonance. But it's a simple. It's like basically saved himself coming up with too many new ideas by putting it up the octave. But it's a dramatic but nice change at the same time. It's a good return on investment, time and return there. So before we review what Haydn has done in the piece overall, I've got a table to show the change. So I just want to take a momentary sidestep and think about why Haydn might have done this, took this approach. Of course, we can't know for sure, but I want to try and think about it from a creative perspective. I want us to imagine and hypothesize just why Haydn might have decided to limit himself so diligently to the use of a variation form where the melody remains unchanged. And moreover, why do this when already working with a string quartet which limits the orchestration variations available to him for varying the music around the melody? So let's imagine then it's 1798, it's the 18th century, we're nearly in the 19th century, and Haydn is hard at work putting the finishing touches to his mega oratorio, The Creation. So he's a busy guy, and yet he still needs to keep publishing new music to maintain his status as a wealthy Viennese composer and plant himself in history as a hugely prodigious one as well, prolific composer, should I say, as well. So he is now residing in Vienna. So what does he do? He turns to the profitable world of the string quartet. He's going to publish a collection of string quartets, because that'll keep the coins rolling in. Keep the florins. Are they using florins at this time? Rolling in. I don't know what the currency is. Anyway, having written all the hard music for his third quartet of the collection, this is obviously Opus 76, number 3. Haydn can't believe it. He's stuck on the simple, slower movement. This movement was supposed to be the easy one. He gesticulates to the heavens above, thinking, scrawling and scribbling out. Suddenly, in a flash of creativity, he recalls a melody he's heard the year before, the Emperor's Hymn, written for the Holy Roman Emperor Francis II's birthday. I think he was also known as Francis I in some of his dominions. And I'm pretty sure he was still the Holy Roman Empire at this point. I think he became like Austro-Hungarian a decade or two later, at some point in the 19th century, post-Napoleonic War, maybe, I don't know. Anyway, a popular, well-known melody, the Emperor's Hymn was at this time. And it was also during a time when copyright laws were not a blot on creativity. There's a lot in copyright laws at the moment with the Ed Sheeran case. But anyway, it's another digression. So Haydn thought, I am going to write a piece using the Emperor's Hymn for my string quartet. That'll get it selling well. So deciding to use the hymn, he then thinks, well, I best not alter the hymn. That would be disrespectful, especially if I were to accidentally add too many notes or something like that. The Emperor might not like that. I best keep it unchanged and change the music around it instead. Suddenly, with a couple of creative swishes, Haydn has several creative foundations to compose on. The melody of the Emperor's Hymn, number one. Secondly, the form, which is going to be theme and variation or variation form. And thirdly, the string quartet, some really big, large-scale creative decisions have been pinned down onto this kind of framework around it. With all this structure in place, he now can't be stopped. He writes out the theme and adds some gentle harmonies around it. The simple setting will let everyone know that they are about to hear variations in the premiere or whatever when it's first performed. But what will Haydn do next? Well, we know, but Haydn thinks to himself, how can I leave myself plenty of space to explore in the later variations? After a moment staring at the page, reviewing his theme, his eye rests on the phrase second violin, which is kindly not in this version of the score. But he goes, aha, I have two violins. I'll use them for my first variation. That way I'll have the gorgeous voice of the cello and the noise of the viola left over for variation 2 and 3. In an instant, Haydn not only has an idea for variation 1, but he also has the idea for variation 2 and 3. For variation 2, he will bring back the cello on the melody, moving the melody down an octave. And for variation 3, he will give the melody to the viola. But what for the final variation? Haydn asks himself. Obvious, he says kind of menacingly. I'll have everyone playing a delicate but rousing rendition of the theme. So obviously I'm not saying this is what happened, but what I am trying to get at is that with orchestration and texture considerations particularly, you can think in large brushstrokes. Creatively, you can lay out some compositional limitations, not only then when Haydn came to write the variations, does he have those, three limitations of ensemble, form, and theme? He starts to lay out further compositional guidelines through the orchestration plan. The variation 1 has 2 players, both violins. This is a substantial restriction on the composition in some ways, but could be seen as a great creative liberation. He knows he's going to write, some kind of 2-part counterpoint, relying on those skills that he learned as a student and through his life and all that kind of stuff. Variation 2, Haydn is going to be writing with the melody for the cello, largely seen as the lowest voice of the text during that movement. It's going to set him up for, creating variations atop of the melody. Variation 3 is going to build his material around the viola with predominantly 3 players playing at any one time, sometimes 2. He'll be saving all 4 of the players for the final variation. So then we've explored how Haydn creates contrast in his string quartet through various techniques such as textural, numeric, orchestrational, and harmonic changes. For example, the final setting of the theme opens with like an E minor, the 6th chord, or submedian rather, which creates a tonal change that's quite striking compared to the opening version. So that's a variation. But obviously, for the purpose of this analysis, we're focusing on the other changes and how they relate to the idea of planning to create contrast while maintaining coherence. As we mentioned earlier, the nature of the composition and the instrumentation of this piece ensures coherence to a certain extent. Therefore, Haydn's approach is focused more on making changes that effectively bring about contrast. Haydn has built coherence into the composition through form, that's variation form and the instrumentation, by using perhaps the most coherent ensemble the String Quartet. To summarize our analysis in a more concise manner, I've created a table that highlights how Haydn utilizes his instruments to create variation. This table can serve as a practical tool for composers, arrangers, and orchestrators looking to guide their compositions effectively. For example, you could reverse engineer the process in preparation for composing a work, asking yourself what instruments will play, the numbers, texture, which, you know, as we've seen in our little story of Haydn, our imagined story, that is, how that can be like a creative limitation, but really quite a liberating one, as it allows you to just focus on writing within a certain framework. So on the left, you'll see a clear layout of the themes, their descending order, so you can easily follow along as we move along across the columns of the table. As we progress through the piece from top to bottom, the next 4 columns highlight the instruments, and how their roles change through the piece. This includes whether they are providing harmony, counterpoint, or the melodic material. And I've tried to color code the parts to show how the different layers are positioned for the most part within this kind of foreground, middle ground, and background idea. While the melody is often the foreground, I believe that this is not always the case, and that this is one of the ways in which Haydn adds depth to the otherwise simple composition. For example, in the first variation, I feel like the melody is middle or background. Sorry, this one here is backgrounded, or middle grounded rather. There's only 2 layers before we're regaining our attention on the cello and then on the viola. Although in this movement, I would say it becomes a little more, because it's large, much more contrapuntal. The other textures do sometimes burst forwards, pushing the melody back and things like that. In the following columns, we see how Haydn plays with the numbers of the instruments in plain numeric form, as you'd be surprised for a numbers column. Uses simple like reductions of numbers, dropping down to, as I say, 2 players here. Then it's kind of 2, 3, 4 players in the next 2 variations before giving us a nice full 4 in this final variation. The texture column is a bit nuanced, as Haydn often combines polyphony and homophony in his variations. Nonetheless, the shifts in texture are subtle but effective tools for creating contrast. Lastly, the final column contains additional notes that capture some of the more nuanced aspects of the variations. For example, Haydn's use of octave transpositions is limited to only 1.5 variations, adding to the sense of contrast and variety. Similarly, his emphasis on suspensions in variation 2 and 3 creates a distinct expressivity in the harmony, and affects the perception of the meter and rhythm as well. Overall, Haydn's careful orchestration and variation techniques offer valuable insights for composers, us, arrangers, and orchestrators looking to create effective contrast and coherence in their works. So, orchestration is a crucial process in creating music for an ensemble or orchestra. It involves arranging and adapting music to take advantage of the capabilities of each instrument while ensuring that the music flows logically and consistently. When planning an effective orchestration, it's essential to consider both contrast and coherence, which we nicely have with my highly contrasted. Where's the coherence? Is it to do with black and white? There's a feeling of coherence in black and white, isn't there? It's most legible, most contrast provides the most legibility. But that's a digression there. Just criticizing my own slide midway through. But yes, when planning an effective orchestration, it's essential to consider both contrast and coherence. Coherence, on the other hand, on one hand rather, refers to the logical and consistent flow of the music. Just one way to achieve coherence is to use a consistent theme and variation form, as Haydn does in this string quartet. Moreover, the orchestration of the music invites or builds perhaps even enforces coherence, as it is limited to the string quartet, a similar group of instruments, as we've said many times through this talk, that blend and combine well together. By holding back certain instruments and introducing them in later variations, Haydn maximizes the contrast within the homogeneous string quartet. Contrast, on the other hand, at least here, refers to variation in texture, harmony, rhythm, and timbre, though variation could and often is also applied to melody in a variation form piece. However, in Haydn's String Quartet Opus 76, number 3, the melody is used as the basis to vary the music around it, with the onus of variation being placed on textural, harmonic, and orchestration changes. To create contrast, then, Haydn varies what is happening around the theme in each variation using octave transpositions, instrument numbers and timbre changes, and subtle changes in texture, harmony, and the rhythm, the harmonic rhythm as well, and the counterpoint. The table provided in the previous section demonstrates these variations, and it is, along with the slides of this talk, going to be made available to any Old Music email subscribers. So make sure you sign up below if you'd like access to it or other similarly cool stuff. A plug within a plug. No shame. Anyway, to conclude then, our final slide. When planning an orchestration, it's essential to consider the limitations and opportunities presented by the ensemble or orchestra being used. In the case of the string quartet, Haydn had a consistent theme and ensemble to work with, which allowed him to explore various orchestration techniques and create contrast while maintaining coherence. However, if he had a larger ensemble, there would be more opportunities for orchestration adventures, but also the risk of wandering into cacophony. Oh, that was supposed to be a great moment where I used the word cacophony and I couldn't say it. But yes, there could be a wandering into chaos if there was not a kind of restriction, some inbuilt coherence restrictors, if you want to call it that. In conclusion, then, when planning an effective orchestration, it is essential to consider both contrast and coherence, and to take advantage of the limitations and opportunities presented by the ensemble or orchestra being used. By doing so, a composer can create music that is both musically engaging and logically consistent. Thank you.